Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the podcast. My name is Jeremy. This is Divergence Media. So, first and foremost, I've got a couple people that I want to introduce. We're bringing onto the team. I think these two are going to bring, a lot of really awesome elements to the team so that we can get a lot of different perspectives at everything that we look at. And I kind of made an announcement earlier that was going to be the case. And the two people that we're bringing on is actually Popeye and Goy Goddess. So I want to give them kind of an opportunity to introduce themselves to you guys, just give a little background. Many of you probably already know them, but if you don't, I want to give them an opportunity to just say hello and, tell them a little bit about themselves. So anyways, Mr. Popeye, sir, how are you today?
I'm doing good, brother. How you doing?
Oh, man, just doing it large, living large. That's what I like to say.
Right?
Do
Enjoying
more,
the moment.
go a little further.
It's all about enjoying the moment, I'm led to believe, brother. If you're not enjoying the moment, from what I've been led to believe, if you're not enjoying the moment, you're either doing it wrong or you're screwing it yourself. Or maybe you're screwing it yourself because you're doing it wrong. What do I know? I just try to enjoy the moment, not get into all that because that messes things up.
Right.
So my basic background is I've been looking into history for most of my life, looking into government stuff, and then started getting into the so-called sovereign free man probably 6-7 years ago due to some legal issues, typical, such as most people. But I kind of got into it so deep that I ended up going to law school. So I'm currently done with my pre-law and in law school, done with my first year, moving on and taking on a completely different approach than most people. But part of the reason why I did what I am doing is because I had it in my mind when I was sitting in jail for something that was supposed to be legal for me to do. It pissed me off so much that I wanted to figure out a way to beat them at their own game. Mm-hmm. And that started ultimately a roller coaster adventure that I'm still not done with. I think I still have a long way to go, but it's been one hell of a wild ride up to this point. I've learned a ton. One of the big things that's been very nice is because of the fact that I'm retired as well. Other than school, I don't have anything really else to do with the life if I don't want to. And so that's allowed me to study some of this stuff more intensely without a lot of obstacles, such as having to go to work every day or whatever.
Sure.
I go pay the bills. No, I don't have to worry about that shit. That's not an issue. I just gotta get to study.
So let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Once you have your law degree, what do you plan to do with that?
Wow. That's a question that I still have fully yet to completely figure out, and that I'm not sure what direction I want to go. Ways, and of course, just things that I get asked all the time, and particularly in certain alternative chat rooms and stuff, is, well, are you gonna be able to be a bar member? How are you gonna be able to defend people the way what you know and still be a bar member and all this other? I don't know all the answers to those questions yet. I really don't. I've already heard from several different stories that there are a few people out there that the real living, breathing man or woman that has gone through law school, gone through past the bar, but not accepted the bar membership, and are actually acting as lawyers in law, not attorneys at law. And there is a difference in that verbiage. And obviously that's part of the topic for this evening, and it is the language that is used and how people don't even understand the difference between what is an attorney versus what is a lawyer. What is the difference between an attorney at law versus a lawyer in law? Because if you're part of it is kind of like this. You can either be at the pool or you can be in the pool. You only get to swim when you're in the pool. You can't swim when you're out of it.
Right.
Okay. The only guy that really is playing is actually in the pool, not the guy standing at the pool. Yeah, it's a very different way of looking at things, a very different concept. And of course, that's where
Sure.
my whole basis of pretty much everything pretty much starts, is understanding who you are as a player in the game. So, and until we
Excellent.
get deep into it, I don't want to go any further with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that you can introduce. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Let me pass it over to Goy Goddess. Goy Goddess, how are you tonight, ma'am?
Good evening, fellas, gentlemen. I am well, thank you.
Awesome.
Um, nice to be here with all of you. Um, so I would just say real quickly that I've been interested in digging down some rabbit holes for quite a few years. I started out with interest in health and nutrition, and over the years was very active about 9/11. Shortly after it happened, I became very active in exposing the truth about what really happened that day. And from that point, I got very much more interested in a lot of more diverse things, all things relevant to that, the financial system, how the geopolitics of the world work, and ended up really becoming concerned over the years more and more. I got I realized that there's much more to this than just the everyday world, that there's some kind of hidden knowledge going on in the world and it's being used against us. Got into reading the Bible and going to church and trying to find out what was on that side of the view from things, and found out more than what most people who were in the church reading the Bible were interested in, which led me even further into more things to think about. And as of late, I've become very interested in the topic that we're going to be discussing tonight, which is language and the spoken word, and the occult in reference to, with regard to rituals and spell casting. So that's where I'm at these days, pretty passionate about looking into all things around that.
You know, it's fascinating because you mentioned going to church, and so even in Christianity, Christians can somewhat can relate to the power of words, because even in the religion of Christianity, words are spoken of as Jesus with a sword out of his mouth. I mean, it's really spoke of as a thing with substance, not just something that goes freely into the air. It's spoken about as if it's a substantive object that could be used. It has so much power.
Oh, yeah. And just to add to that real quick, even more than that, is the Bible is referred to as the Word of God, and that God, it says in the beginning, spoke the world into existence.
The Word was God, and God was the Word.
Exactly. So, yeah, it's quite fascinating.
So we're going to get, I guess, a little bit into... You can't be sending gifs like that, Cliff, while I'm...
I just thought I'd say, hello, I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah,
Don't worry.
Yep. So, yeah, that is the topic of tonight, of course. And that is, a rebuttal to linguistic presumptions. Quite the tongue twister. And we're going to get into that, just the way that we use language, right? So, for example, even right now, I say the word we. Well, who is we? If I say right now, for example, I want to use this as an example, and I'm going to pass it over to you guys to kind of carry this on. But if I say the word we, maybe on surface level, I could make the argument that, well, we would be all humankind, because, of course, for all humans, it's important how we use language. But then even then, I can go further and say, well, if I had just come home with my dog from the veterinarian, and my wife asked me and said, well, where have y'all been? And I said, well, we were at the veterinarian hospital. Well, of course, language doesn't matter to my dog, right? So I can't really use the word we properly in that sentence at all. So that's how words can become very important. And I'm going to pass this over to Cliff right now and just let you guys kind of run with this. Cliff, good to hear from you. Glad you're here. How you doing, sir?
Yeah, just woke up.
Just woke up.
Just kidding. Yeah. I mean, words are really, I think, the doorway to the occult, because they're symbols. They create images in the mind. They are spelled. That's where you get the word spell and spelling. they if you put an S in front of words, you get swords, so they can be weaponized. Uh, the words have multiple meanings. That's another trick, of course, that is somehow more in the English language, it would seem. Uh, and we are word controlled. People are word controlled if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we can respond to pictures and things, but we respond to words. That's how we function. That's our programming, our data set. So, yeah, I mean, I've met Popeye quite a while back now, and he was into the same sort of vein I was, into sort of looking at the system of the law field, which is, definitely looking at the system. It's not so much thinking for yourself because you're getting their information, but that got me into the value of words, and then. So yeah, I mean, you remember that, eh, Popeye? We seemed to sort of click on the same
Yep.
ideas. Yep.
Well, yeah. Well, I think that you and I clicked on a couple of different levels, and a lot of it was because, particularly when we first met, and the group that we were associating with at that time or participating with, they had a very set, um, regimented idea of how things were, and I saw things specifically very differently. And one of the big things that I saw, and you and I both happen to agree with it, and was in complete contrast to this other group, and that is everything is a contract. And they really didn't like that, but you and I did see that, and because of that, we quickly gravitated towards each other. And yeah, I can't agree more in that it is all about the language. The language is casting spells. It's so much of everything that is us. It really truly is, because we rely on words even in our thinking. We still, depending on what it is that we're thinking, we're still using words to put pieces together. Even if I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking about building a house, I'm still using the words of the different materials, thinking, okay, well, I got to build this frame. That frame's going to be pine to get this grade, that grade, whatever. I'm going to need some plywood. I'm going to need some siding. I'm going to need this. I'm going to need that, all the way out to the stucco or the wood side or whatever it is. And I can't put this house together without thinking of these to build
George
this house.
Orwell. George Orwell actually even touched on that, didn't he? With the concept of newspeak, and by changing the language and minimizing the language, you actually very effectively were able to dumb people down. Because if you don't have the language and the words to define a thought, how can you possibly have that thought?
Exactly. And of course, and this is one of the things as a contractor, and it quickly started to occur to me as I'm going through law school. And one of the messages that was pounded through us all the way through pre-law, and first words out of the professor's mouth and the first day of law school is words matter. Words have meaning. Words matter. You have to understand that. And once you recognize that even the people that are saying that don't necessarily know that the words that they're using, what they actually mean. It is
Sure.
very interesting at that point where you realize, okay, well, these people at this level, we're talking professorship at a well-accredited university, Purdue University, and they don't know what specific words mean. And this is part of why, when it comes to specific words, particularly, I cringe when I have to use them, simply because I have yet to elevate myself, my thinking, the knowledge that I have of words, to figure out how to word around and still get the same message across fairly succinctly without having to go into long dissertations. So,
So for many out there, though, let's start at the very beginning, right? Because when we talk about these words and we kind of get down this, many people I think are going to have a hard time understanding, hey, why are words so important? If I am able to successfully convey my thoughts to somebody else, if I am successfully able to have somebody else understand what it is that I'm trying to say, why is choosing certain words over other words so important? Maybe let's start there and just try to define why this is so important to begin with.
Well, in my estimation, there's two parts that kind of build into that, but it goes back to really understanding, and this has always been my base message, is understanding who we are as a player in the game and versus who we've been told.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Because it comes down to the entire system is based on a couple of different things. Hearsay and assumption driven by linguistic sleight of hand. And the hearsay starts with who we are. It starts with, and this is a slight twist that most people never think about, but it's the reality of things, and on a very deep but very logical level, the birth certificate. There's always so much talk, particularly in the sovereign free man movement, the birth certificate, the bond, this, that, and the other thing. Okay, that's all wonderful. That's all great. But what it comes down to is the idea of you being that name, that legal name, and or knowing any of the information that is on that so-called birth certificate. And specifically what I'm
goes back to the straw man theory, correct? We're
talking
about the straw man,
a bit. It could be. And in fact, even that, there's a little bit, if you look up the word dummy in Black's Law, you will find out that the name is not the straw man. You become the straw man for the name. You're acting as the dummy. It's very specific. And again, words matter. You have to, you really, to understand some of these things, you'd have to really sit down with several dictionaries and start going through them to see what is actually happening. Going back to being a carpenter, one of the analogies that I use is in the form of a question: would you ever use a saw to pound nails into a wall?
Sure.
And the typical answer I get is no. And I ask, well, why? And a lot of times it's, well, because it could be dangerous. I might cut my hand on the blade if I'm trying, whatever. Well, yeah, there you go. Besides the fact that it's just not the right tool, it could be dangerous to the operator, plus other people and or whatever. Well, sure. Words are tools, no different. So if you don't know that you've got a hammer and you're about to pound nails, you might want to check the tool itself.
So before we move on too much further, I know we're about to get into birth certificates and stuff, but just keeping it right here at the beginning, I understand also that Goy Goddess has done some good research on this and was actually the one that suggested this topic. So Goy, I would actually like to hear from you on why you feel like this is so important as well, just coming from your perspective.
Cool, thanks. At the very beginning of all of this, there's this understanding of the nature of this reality is an energetic, electromagnetic system. This is the construct of material form. It's an energy, vibration, and frequency. And with keeping that in mind, when you speak, you're putting out a vibrational essence into the air, the ether. And it is like the first point from the thought in the mind to the expression into the formed world. And when we speak words, we're not only saying a word that references some kind of a mental, like it triggers a thing in our mind that it has some kind of meaning, significance, but we're also hearing a vibrational signal with that. And so a person could be, just by the energy of their speaking, they're communicating. Like you could hear someone speaking another language, but you still get an impression of the essence of what they're trying to say. Like you don't understand the details, but you see where they're coming at. So there's a very emotional aspect to speech and the way we say words. Like, are they Are they kind, when we're explaining something? Or are we angry when we're saying it? And that, I think, has a huge impact along with the words themselves. So it gets to be like a very important, profound stage on which we're working with words.
I'll just quickly chime in there. Yeah, we were talking about that last night because we do group role plays, as some of you know. And so we role play dealing with people or dealing with agents or dealing with government or whoever's difficult to deal with, really. And we found that, yeah, it's good to come up with good words and put them in the right places, but how you say it and your come from is very important. It can go a long way to convincing someone.
Well, yeah,
So, yeah,
particularly you
totally.
could even be dealing with Cologuard. It works with Cologuard. How you deal with things, literally, bro. That's what I could tell the story real quick, but I tried to get a test done, and an old man didn't want to have the colonoscopy. Cologuard didn't want to give me the test because I supposedly didn't do something they requested. I asked to meet the claimant, asked who was assuming liability. They decided to just go ahead and send me the test.
Mm-hmm.
The language that you use, bro. It's the language that we use. It really is.
But we've got definitely a couple different perspectives here, right? So from Popeye's perspective, we see that there is a very legal angle that we take and we use language for. So that is quite literally, if you use the right language and ask the right questions, then the very system that we operate in it really gets exposed, and you find out that there's a lot of things being hidden from you through truth, especially in the legal system. However, from Goy Goddess's perspective, she's almost looking at it from a much more spiritual aspect, where words, like she said, they put off a certain frequency. And again, even I'm sure a lot of this probably does come from her experience in church. In church and Christianity, they'll speak as if you can speak an illness into somebody. So if you have somebody that's constantly speaking negatively, or they are, or speaking positively, it can have an actual physical impact on the people around you. So there's
I would agree.
I think multiple things to consider when we're talking about language.
There's also the social aspect that's kind of somewhere in between.
Sure.
I believe that there is, and this is one of the things that actually I think that this is the area that is the most important, is the daily conversation between one and another. And the reason being, and this is my perspective on it, but this is something that I realized along the way, particularly when I did something called challenging jurisdiction, in the way that I was led to believe would be the best. But ultimately, it came down to, if government is the same as Santa Claus, it's just an imagination. And you're saying something along the lines of, well, I don't believe in Santa Claus, but yet I want to see your evidence of jurisdiction because I'm standing in Santa Claus's village. What? Okay, wait a minute. Whoa. And this is from people that are allegedly anarchist types, not believing in government and all this. It's like, well, wait a minute. If you don't believe in Santa Claus, but yet you just admitted that you're in Santa Claus's village, didn't you just give life to Santa Claus? Sure. So, and of course, this is on one extreme, but on a daily basis, when just out and about, and just say, like this afternoon, Olive Oil and I are out bouncing around, going to the stores, and I hear, and even Olive Oil is in some of this. Like I said, I'm caught in some of this, but Olive Oil, I'll just use her as an example. She's still has her mind wrapped around ownership. Mine this, mine that. Everything is mine, mine, mine. And she knows that she can't own anything, but yet it's just one of those things. She's near the same age, and there's been a lot of years of conditioning, and she doesn't push on herself. She gets it, but she doesn't. She just lives her life smelling the flowers right now. That she doesn't want to be involved.
Yeah. That happens. That's my wife's
normal
the
and
same
typical,
way, but
right? And a lot of them are. But let me finish off just real quick. And what I wanted to get to, I hear this ambiguous language on a regular basis out and about, just listening to people talk. Mm-hmm. People walking through the store. and particularly like right now, we're coming up on so-called elections. There's all this turmoil of the so-called new little king, the hood ornament for the 300-year-old wreck that they've been driving, or whatever, and they're talking about, oh, our country this and our country that. And it's like, okay, wait a minute, who's our? What do you mean by country? Oh, I'm a U.S. citizen. Okay, do you even know what the U.S., what do you mean by the U.S.? Do you know what the actual technically, it's getting used, and it perpetuates and reinforces ideas that don't exist in reality. So that is it.
All presumptions, aren't they?
Yes, all presumptions.
Operating on presumptions.
Well, that's why I say, well, actually, hearsay and assumptions. Hearsay and assumptions. It's all hearsay as to when, because if I say our country to somebody, well, that's just hearsay. And then they're assuming that I'm right.
So let's go ahead and break in here. Let's find out who we are. So many times I've heard, Popeye, you've said, we need to know who we are. We need to know what, where we stand in the game. Cliff, where do you stand in the game? What kind of player are you in this game?
Oh, good question. Well, from my understanding, I've got a really strong penchant, and have for many years had a penchant towards public-private, what's called public-private. And private, of course, starts in yourself. If you don't speak it, it's private. And so anything from there escalating into sharing that privacy is becoming public. And the more you enter out into the world and share it, it becomes public. So eventually what happens is which starts to get more entangled as we get into records. So it starts out with you, your thoughts, your body in the world, and then you've got record making, which is memorialization, say, of contracts, or signs, or even actions that could be construed as a presumptive thing. So getting into the presumption or presumptions are usually things that are just signs. They're not anything fixed and agreed to. So generally, I keep my privacy private and my public stuff public. And when I want to make my public record, then I want it to serve me best. So I'll put the public thing in a good light. It's like any corporation or commerce. They're always going to put on, hi, we're here to sell you something, and it's going to be good. And they probably are good. But the whole thing is selling it, and you're selling yourself every day. So if someone is going to be the boss of themselves, where I'm going with this and from my perspective, then they have to understand how to act like a boss. Otherwise, their paperwork or their words even mean shit, because actions speak louder than words, I think it's been said.
This is a lot of self-discipline, to be able to separate those two internally and say these things are public, these things are private. But that's also a different way of looking at things that the very things, once you speak them, you've now externalized that, and that is now public.
Yeah.
Am I viewing that correctly? Is that how I'm understanding this?
What do you mean by the last part? What?
So like you said, so public and private internally, right? So if I am, as soon as I speak something, if I speak something to somebody else, I am making that information public. That's just I gathered that sort of out of what you're saying. Now,
not really. No, not really. It's becoming shared. But if you talk to someone in your home that nobody else knows, and you confide in the person, you say, "Let's keep the secret," or "This is between you and I," that's still private. But obviously, it leans into a potential that's now out of your private world. Has now got potential to be. Like going back to the actions speak louder than words, he'll say, I won't tell anyone, and then he'll go out and tell someone.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's not guaranteed that's going to happen. So public, if you really want to make, and it is a big topic and it's got a lot of details, but if you really want to make public, then you're talking about the public record, which is every institution that's connected to government which is what a lot of things, right? Banks and
Right.
doctors and even chemists and anything to do with heavy regulation with government is going to be public if you make a record, because they'll especially these days, they'll track and trace everything and make a record.
Mm-hmm.
So the public is encroaching on the private world, and this is the big problem. People have to understand what's happening, or at least compensate this public encroachment into their lives in such a way as to keep private. And that's why I started out with myself going out into the world, because if you get that understanding and look at it from that perspective and try and figure it out for yourself, you'll be able to dodge a lot of these bullets that come, you know. So, but it's really it is complex, because agreements are the thing that creates, say, a contract, like that's contracted down. A potential of a thing is contracted down into a potential that we agree to. But that does not mean the agreement will be kept. So not all agreements are solid. So it kind of goes into a bit of that. It gets very esoteric and recondite.
So
Well, can I
before we,
jump in real quick for something on that?
yeah,
Just to cover something real quick. When you talk about contracts, and this is one thing that, again, like I was saying earlier, Cliff and I gravitated towards each other because we recognize contracts in things and most people don't. And so just to give a quick example as to how quickly and easily contracts are entered into and discharged. And most people think, again, that a contract is all about a writing, this, that, and the other. No. About 90 to 95% of all contracts in the world on a daily basis have no writing, no memorialization attached. And the reason being is because it's just this simple. You walk into your favorite sandwich shop at noon to have a sandwich. The girl behind the counter, she knows you. She's seen you a dozen times, a couple dozen times, whatever. You nod to her to say, I want the regular, because she's on the phone. She nods to you as if to say, yeah, as soon as I'm done with the phone. A couple of minutes later, there's a sandwich on the counter. You go over, you pay for it. You just entered into and discharged a unilateral contract. It's just that simple. Every time you enter into a store to buy groceries, you go to the gas station to buy some gas. Whatever you do to so-called purchase an item of whatever nature, to get services of whatever nature, even if there is not a writing attached, it is still a contract. So, and again, gets into a lot of language, but yeah, entering into contracts are far more about what actions have taken place, the mindset, far more than anything in writing. So anyway, let you back.
go ahead, Goddess. I want to give you an opportunity to chime in here. You got anything to add here? Here in a minute, I think we're probably going to go ahead and break right on into the concept of the birth certificates and kind of delve into that. But before we move on, I wanted to give you an opportunity also.
Thanks. Yeah, we're kind of covering a lot of territory, but connecting with what Popeye was saying, I would say that the whole way that we conceive of things and understand things in our consciousness and our free will is really crucial. And to tie in with what Popeye was saying about contracts, and the sleight of hand with how things are negotiated, that is really, really important, because a huge thing that we're dealing with in the world is deception. And so understanding language and the subtle things that like just the idea that not that have I been sold a lie, but have I bought one, that the onus of personal responsibility is ultimately on each individual. And in our society, we're encouraged to shirk personal responsibility, leave it to others to figure it out, deny wanting to be involved all the time, to not stand up and to take on responsibility. And yet our power to address all these issues in the world is very much about taking on personal responsibility in a very positive and empowering way. And language can be a huge aspect of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Absolutely. I would love to go ahead. Let's break into these birth certificates. I'm actually curious. I'm going to learn a thing here. So, for those speaking out, if you think that I know anything about this topic, you are dead wrong. I am definitely learning a thing or two. Linguistics is something that I've been, wanting to get into and get a little interested into. I've been exposed to it, but I've by no means ever dived into it as much as these guys have. So maybe I'm going to pass this over to Cliff right now. Cliff, do you want to open us up on this?
Sure. And yeah, with the linguistics, there's neurolinguistics, which is to do with the neurons in the brain, and then you got another one called psycholinguistics. That's another one. There's probably more than that, But linguistic just means language. That's all it is. So it's just a type of language. So yeah, birth certificates. Yeah, I don't mind talking about that. Of course, I could talk for a long time on birth certificates, but we'll just cover the basics that I've compressed into what I know. So I have messed around with the birth certificate or certificates. Some people that might have heard Bill Turner, he was into the birth certificate thing. Check out his work online, Bill Turner, New Zealander, another fellow New Zealander. And he, just as an example quickly, he said, oh yeah, Cliff, I get a whole bunch of them. He'll get a whole bouquet of birth certificates and use them. So, so it does go really deep. The birth certificate is actually, it is actually money. It can be used as payment, and I've used it as payment. But the key would be to understand a bit about the birth certificate. There's tons of stuff out there. It is a trust. And once you understand, I think, contracting and birth certificates, then you'd start to see how to use it. So those two things, in my opinion, go together. I do disagree at this stage with people, say, bringing their birth certificate into court and saying, discharge this debt, Your Honour, because I really haven't heard of that working ever. So it is a particular assumption. Like if all of your shit in the public, your license and your bank account and all that, it has to go back to the birth certificate. And you can't even open a bank account here. And I've tried to do it. I've asked, and they said, no, you need government ID. So what's government ID? It goes back to the birth certificate. You may not drive. You may not have a license. What are you going to do for ID? If you have no ID, you'd have to give the birth certificate. The bank would go, okay, fair enough. So I've even experimented with the bank to give the bank the birth certificate and implying that they use it to set off a debt. I've done that. And I didn't get into trouble, but they said, we don't take that payment or that type of payment. And I got another guy to do it for me. There's a guy acting on behalf of me. He was like a debt broker. So I've had a real lot of mucking around with it and a lot of fun, and I never got in trouble. And I have used it for medical and things like that. You can definitely use it for that. So yeah, it's a big topic and quite interesting. Yeah.
Well, I guess let's pass this over to Popeye. Popeye, I know you've got a lot to say about this.
Yeah, thanks. I do, and of course,
before we go any further, though, your microphone has sort of become very trebly and chopped down. I can barely hear you.
Okay, hold on a second, Hillary. Change something here.
Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, great. All right, so this is my basic take on it. And everything that Cliff said, from everything that I've studied and so on, I would have to say is absolutely true. And, of course, this is one of those topics that I'd love to get into at another show, and that is this thing called But. For right now, as it stands, and particularly when it comes to understanding who you are, much about the birth certificate as realizing that there's the game, but then there's the game within the game. And where I'm going to basically take everything is the game within the game right now. And that is this. That birth certificate and all the so-called information on it and what it actually means to each and every one of us as an individual. Now, there's a couple of different parts of this. One is the birth certificate in itself, and that is when you look at the birth certificate, it's on banknote paper. It's got all that fancy fringe around the edge. It says the state of whatever across the top, and it's got the seal and the embossment and the barcodes and signatures, and essentially comes down to it's God's gift to documentation as far as the legal world is concerned. The problem with that is particularly when using it even as a form of ID to get those other IDs, called driver's license, the so-called passport, or whatever it is. Even more so, if a summons, a subpoena, or whatever from a court, you get a ticket. That name is, as far as us as the individual is concerned, is all hearsay. From the best I can see, because, well, at least from my own experience, I can't remember a damn thing from the day that I was allegedly born. I can't remember. I couldn't say I could pick my mom out of a lineup of one and say, yeah, that's the woman. No, because I wasn't conscious at that level that day. The so-called birth certificate, it's not even filled out right there in the living room. It's filled out days later somewhere, some office somewhere. So to admit to and or claim any of that information to be true is completely perjuring yourself. You're essentially admitting, you're pleading guilty to something you have no first-hand knowledge of. Why would you do that? At any time, anywhere, ever. And ultimately, the system is based on they need you to claim that name in that courtroom. They cannot move on.
So am I understanding this? Let me see if I'm understanding this correctly. So the first obligation that the court has is to prove that the very laws that they're holding you accountable to apply to you. And then who are you? Is that where we're?
Well, yeah. Well, kind of you just backed into it, but it starts with who are you? And this is the key thing, because of the fact that that legal name, the name that's on the Social Security, the name that's on the birth certificate, if you look at it from the standpoint of, well, that's my birth certificate. Well, no, I don't think so, because I believe that, again, the law says the holder of a document is actually the owner of the document. You only get a copy of the so-called birth certificate. It's somebody else that actually allegedly holds the original. This fake entity, Santa Claus, called the state. But yet, it's the state that issues that original birth certificate. It's the state's name across the top of the document. That would be another indication as to who the owner of everything is. Same as the so-called Social Security card. It's the Social Security's name across the top of the name that has now got a number attached to it.
Okay. I believe I'm starting to understand
the process
here.
But the carbon-based material. What's that?
Oh, I think you cut out there for a minute. I didn't realize you were still talking. I think you cut out for a second, but go ahead.
Okay. One of the mechanical parts of the system is that number, that so-called Social Security number that's attached to that legal. They cannot process, say, like you get arrested and they're processing you through this. They cannot process that carbon-based material without that, because there's too many of the same name, so-called name. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a huge issue right there. Am I a name? Am I that legal name? Or am I the real living, breathing man? Once I recognize that there's a huge differentiation between what information is on that birth certificate and how I'm using it at the time. Because if you were to look at it from the real world sense, and this straight technical right out of the law dictionaries, the law library, and so on. If you assume something to be yours, but it's not, such as you assume the legal name is yours, not belonging to the state. Technically speaking, you're trespassing. Now, when this happens most is when You're using that so-called birth certificate to get other so-called pieces of identification, such as a driver's license or a passport, what have you. And they always ask you you got to have that birth certificate. And of course, you're told don't use the birth certificate as form of ID. Well, this turns into an official inducement of an error. You're actually creating an error because now you're doing something that's technically you've been told not to do, but now you're telling you the only way you can do this is to do what we're telling you that we told you not to do. What? Wait a minute. You're telling me to do something you told me not to do. Yeah. So it's an official inducement to incur an error. So now, once you've assumed that name, then the next part of the process is you use it as that form of ID. Now you've committed fraud. You just committed fraud because you've used something that doesn't technically belong to you as if it's yours. And this is straight technical, right out, like I said, right out of the dictionaries, right out of the law library. And this isn't just me. When we figured this one out, there was several of us working on this, and it over the course of probably a month, there was several of us working on several different aspects, and we'd come together and brought all the information together, and this is the condensed version, the culmination of it, right there. Bam. So go ahead.
Yeah, I would say let me pass it over to Goy Goddess for a minute, because I understand. I think you've done some studying on this too, as well, correct?
Yeah, I have looked into a lot of that legal things with how, this fictional straw man identity, the corporate law, the corporate legal system, which is uniform commercial code law that we're under, the spelling of names with all capital letters versus the mixture of capital or lowercase, and what that signifies. Capita Papa can tell me, but it's been a while since I've said all that or looked into it. But yeah, and it does put us into a rather bizarre kind of status with which we engage with the Post Institute of Government. But I also, from many years ago, I got really into Mark Passio's work, and he broke down the word government to the Latin roots, gubernare, control, mente, mind. And so essentially it's a mind control system, and which is essentially we're under a big spell. Essentially that's what it is. And and I'll let you go back on that, Popeye, in a minute. But I was going to add a few things for a second. And I was going to say that as children, we go to the government schools, or most do. We a lot of people have grown up experiencing that and understand what goes on in the classroom and how we're taught spelling, which is what is actually the process of when we understand how things are formed into words and how to use words and what the meanings of them are and how we express intention. And that's completely tied to the realm of rituals and spell casting. And so it's very fascinating how the mind works, and the quote magic and the hypnosis and the subconscious and the subliminal. And so many people are affected by things and they don't know it. They're not wholly conscious of it. And I have a little clip from 9/11 that I wanted to Jeremy to play. It's just 1 minute of the day of 9/11 and Bush in the classroom with the children. Do you want to play that, Jeremy?
Yeah, let me cue that up real quick. We're just going to play about the first minute or so here.
Yeah.
And many of you have watched this before, but perhaps maybe you've never watched it in this context. So we're going to cue up about the first minute or so. Let's watch.
Get ready to read all these words on this page without making a mistake. Look at the letter at the end and remember the sound it makes. Get ready.
Kite.
Yes, kite. Get ready to read this word the fast way. Get ready.
Kid.
Yes, kid. Sound it out. Get ready.
Kid.
Sound it out. Get ready.
Kid.
What word?
Kid.
Yes, kid. Boys and girls, sound this word out. Get ready. Steal. What word? Steal. Yes, steal. Read these words the fast way. Get ready. Playing. Yes, playing. Get ready. Must. Yes, must. Let's read these words the fast way without making a mistake. Get ready. Kite. Yes, kite. Get ready. Kit. Yes, kit. Get ready. Steal. Yes, steal. Get ready. Playing. Yes, playing. Get ready. Must. Yes, must. Boys and girls, pick your reader up from under your seat. Open your book up to left.
So, of course, we've all seen that. And of course, it's fascinating that on 9/11 they were saying, plane must hit steel. But I think also the reason why we're looking at this clip is just the way in which they learn these words. It is repetitive. It is just repeating the words, memorizing the way they're spelled, which I suppose is the way you would have to learn words. But Goy, I'm going to let you, comment on that. Of course, that was your clip that you wanted to show. So.
Yeah, and a lot of people looking at that had commented that they felt that that was a form of a ritual being done in the classroom because the words, even if they weren't exactly the spelling for the word, the phonics were there. Like someone said, it doesn't say plane, it says playing, and steel could be E-A-L or E-E-L. It still is pronounced the same. Yeah. And they're essentially chanting words that were being synchronized with the events of the planes supposed to be hitting the towers in New York at the same time on 9/11, or relatively close to that time. So it was kind of an eerie thing. And it was suggested that this was a completely contrived occurrence, like they were participating in something and then they didn't even realize it. So I thought that was rather fascinating. And that, to this day, we know that people organize and get together with intentions in groups and do rituals and essentially practice spell casting because they're using words, chanting, and focusing energy and trying to push their will into manifestation.
Yep.
So
I wouldn't mind getting a bit deeper into that just to see, clarify. So yeah, the focusing of energy is done by the immediate, because everyone's got TVs all around the world and it all came on at the same time. And I remember when it happened and everyone was watching the TV for hours, watching these buildings and then watching them fall. And it kept repeating. And what that's called is psychic driving. They're driving it, that's falling again. The building's falling again. Then they call it 9/11. So every time you ring for an emergency, or in the news as emergency, they called 9/11. You think of that again. Psychic driving.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a huge psychological component to that. And so much of everything that the, quote, government is involved in is psychological operations. And so we're constantly being told and programmed through all the media and the medium about how to think and feel about everything. And that's why essentially when we get invading our privacy will be ultimately to analyze us for thought crimes. And right now we're about to see this huge surge on the internet with Google and DARPA removing things and including things that are truthful because they feel it is not right for us to hear and know about it. So it's really quite a kind of a battle going on here for our ability for freedom and free thought. And okay, I had one more thing I want to share, but I'll let someone.
Go ahead.
So the only ultimately I had, and this was again something years ago I picked up from Mark Passio, but it's very relevant. Also tied in with the mind and understanding and thinking, we have the biggest black op government I wouldn't call it an organization, but it's it's the combination of all the military, the Air Force, Marines, Navy, and Air Force, and all the like the FBI, CIA, NSA agencies into one overarching umbrella group called the National Reconnaissance Office, and they're in Washington, D.C. And it's just really kind of interesting, but they have mission patches. And if Cliff wanted to put up that picture, it's just one of the many.
I got it pulled up here. I'll pull it up here. I got it on the screen here.
It's really fascinating how we have the military so deeply into the occult with all these like ritual things on their patches, and they tie into wizards and warlocks and mythological deities and all these alien stuff. And it's really a lot of things that are outside of what most people in their straightforward thinking mind would think would be relevant to that kind of thing. But it suggests more about the energies at play and what we're the depth of what we're really engaged with here.
Yeah, these pictures are very interesting. Even then, I was noticing some of the. Let's go through here. So a lot of these people, where you actually have a human, they've either got something blocking out one eye, or they have an eye patch. Where you have a human and not a creature, they seem to have just one eye or one eye visible. Not in all cases. Here's this. What is this? Looks like a sea goddess of some type, or a witch.
Yep. There's a saying.
Hey, Jeremy, just real quick. Did you know that Black's Law, a human, is a monster?
That's fascinating. So we are monsters.
Yeah. And of course, and this is something that actually is some of the basis of what we're talking about too. Regardless, and this even goes right back to Cliff's public versus private that he was speaking of earlier. Anything and everything that you ever say is, look at it from the legalese standpoint. Everything that comes out of your mouth. Mm-hmm. And the reason being is because at any time, at any place, that's all that really matters if whatever is called upon. It's not the formal English, it's not the street language, it's the legalese that matters. It's the only language that actually matters. And so and this is part of why I say, like, when we're talking just in general terms, use the word humans, humanity,
Sure. Yeah.
all the time. And I just recently, just as of a couple of years ago, figured this out. One thing real quick, and I'm going to have to get out of here pretty soon, but one thing I wanted to touch on real fast too, and I'll jump back out, and that is what Goy Goddess was just talking about, and about 9/11 and some of the things that were said about that and so on. This reminded me of something that would be a great topic to talk about, and that is propaganda and the crazy mind that was Edward Bernays. The reason why I bring him up is because this is just a small example of something that he's done. It's still happening. It happened on 9/11, and it's going to continue to happen. And that is the way this man thought, and how he could get people to say things that they knew weren't true, just to promote something that, or whatever. After I believe it was the Liberty, the boat that got sunk, that was originally thought to have been sunk by the German army, has since been found that the explosion came from the inside. When that ship sank and all the men that drowned on that drowned, the basic saying to get the American so-called public, the masses, behind the war effort was this one little saying: where there's smoke, there's fire. Saying, well, there had to be something. Well, the fact of the matter is, even just that saying in itself, where there's smoke, there's fire, that's not true. Where there's smoke, there's usually not fire. Most of the time where there's smoke, it's smoldering.
Right.
I mean, seriously, where there's a real good fire, there's no smoke to it. Oil smokes all the time and it's not on fire. Cigarette smoke, they're not on fire. Smoke happens all the time, it's not on fire. But I've said these words before. I've promoted something when I knew that it wasn't true.
An interesting example of that is actually, do you remember the the hot coffee lady with McDonald's. You guys remember that, where she spilled her hot coffee and everybody thought, "Oh
Yes.
wow, what a crazy lady!" Right? Well, there's actually much more to that story. She was actually severely burned, and she was not the only person to actually have problems at the time. So apparently, McDonald's at that particular time, their coffee was actually ridiculously hot, and this woman legitimately experienced horrific burns from this coffee. But what had happened is McDonald's launched a massive smear campaign against her. So
Yep.
these were I mean, so they planned this, and so this became public discourse. The public bought into this idea of, look at this crazy lady. How nuts is she that she's having to sue people? Everyone knows that coffee is hot, but it's not that the coffee was hot. I mean, McDonald's legitimately had an issue, and they did not want to spend the money to fix all of their equipment. So instead, once they were being sued for this, and multiple other people had also filed lawsuits and complained, instead of just admitting that they'd done something wrong, to save face, they launched a massive smear campaign against her. So that should show you, because if you were around and alive during that time, you'll remember that, because that was a big deal. Everybody was talking about this, and that was by design by McDonald's. So if McDonald's is able to do that, just imagine what the powers higher than them are able to do.
Exactly. And not only can I confirm, for as much as I can confirm through the court papers that I have read many times, because that specific case has been covered in multiple classes for multiple different reasons. And everything that you just said, Jeremy, is absolutely correct. In fact, to add a little bit more, the lady that got burned, she didn't want any kind of huge settlement or anything. She just wanted her medical bills covered. That's all she wanted.
Yeah.
It turned into the fiasco because of essential attorneys. Really, that's why. It had nothing to do with her. She just wanted it to be done quietly. And you're right, there were a lot of other people, so she had a lot of prerequisite damage to a lot of other people to show that it was completely foreseeable for what happened to her. Anyway, guys, I've got to jump out. Love y'all, and I'll talk to you later.
Be good, man. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. I'll talk to you later, guys.
Yeah, see you, Popeye. Thanks.
Good evening.
So yeah, Cliff, I want to kind of pass it back to you. We'll be closing it out here pretty shortly. We've been going at it for about an hour, so I guess closing statements on language. What do you guys want the public to know before we close out?
Yeah, well, the most important thing I've found is that people take for granted words. They say the word, but they don't necessarily really understand it. And that seems to be the reason why we're in the shit we're in, is people take too much for granted. So a word that you get in the habit of looking up words. If a word, especially if a word jumps out at you in your day, like Seinfeld, you wake up every day and it's a new show, and it has a theme. If a word comes up, look it up if you don't understand it. Or if a word is interesting to you, look it up and understand it. Discuss it even. And these, when you start doing that, you can you sort of get excited to learn new words too, or looking at law and stuff. Too many people out there go, "Oh, the law! I don't want to learn the fucking law. It's boring," and it is. I mean, who wants to read statutes all day long? So but the words itself, say like Bouvier's. There's a free Bouvier's PDF. What is it? 1870 or something like that. Just pick the free one. It doesn't matter if it's in the 1800s, and it's like a little book of wisdom. And it's to me, it's like a Middle Eastern wisdom book, because it's telling you the exactness of what is fair and right. What's private, what's public. It's amazing. Yeah, just get into it. Look into it. Look at the old stuff. The new stuff is too robotic. And it's a bit stupid.
So, Goy, do you have any closing statements?
I would say that I think it's really valuable to become very conscious of words and how we're using them, and to slow ourselves down to appreciate what it is that we're trying to communicate, and think about the words and be very conscious of them when we say them. I think that we have the potential to really address and deal with a lot of the problems that we're perceiving in the world. And a lot of it has to do with our consciousness and our intention and our free will. So when we see things like, I don't see fixing the quote system. I think it's intentionally something that is an adversarial concept to our well-being, and that the best we could do is to create anew and decide consciously what we are going for in our existence in the world, to become actively engaged in creating a new reality that would supplant the one that we no longer feel really has any service. It doesn't serve us. So I would say, just in closing, that I think working with consciously with our speech and thoughts, and using our creative free will to intentionally strive to think up new and more positive things that we want to experience in the world.
Very good. Yeah, I like that you end on positivity. So that's always good. That's always good. Finding ways to be positive is always very important.
Yep.
Thanks.
So I do have a couple things I want to share before we close out. One, and I've had this concept in my mind for quite a long time, and I've shared it with quite a few people before. But if we look at so there's two sources here I want to use. One is, of course, 1984 and George Orwell's concept of newspeak. And what I want you to do is mentally put that on your mind on like a left side of a scale. Okay. On the other side of things, there is a movie called Arrival, and in this movie, they have this concept that aliens come down to Earth, and we have a language expert. She's world-renowned language expert, and her job is to go and find a way to communicate with these aliens. And what she finds is that once she understands the language of this alien race, she is now able to perceive time and space completely differently. Now, just using that as an example, right? So on the right-hand side, you have this concept that through advanced language, you can actually view the world and think at a much higher level. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the concept that if you dumb down your language, you will actually become very stupid and not actually be able to have conscious thoughts. With that known, if that is true, then it would only make sense that the more you can expand your vocabulary, the more you can understand new words, the clearer and the better your thoughts will be. Again, if you don't have a word to describe a thought, how can you possibly have that thought? So one of our most important things we can possibly do is to try to expand our vocabulary, but then also very surgically use those words that we do understand, right? Understand, for example, they've put on there multiple times. So as we learn these words, we need to learn how to use them very surgically, and that's something that I'm working on every day. We that kind of word, for example, is very vague. What do I mean by we? Right? It's these kind of habits that are extremely hard to break.
Yep, I think what you said at the start of that with the Alien movie, and I've seen that movie too, by the way. I can't remember the name of it, but very interesting. I think you're 100% right. I think that is exactly what I'm trying to get to, and you've kind of gotten to it now. And that is that if you learn words and their true understanding, just even your own understanding, but look it up, look at what the word says, try and get as many definitions of it as possible. And then that naturally leads you to other words and all that, right? But once you start to get a good vocabulary, especially in lawful words, as some people that know me I've gone over a lot of words that are good to use. And a lot of the time, the general public, we'll call them, don't use these words. You'll hear, if you were to use them, they'd say, oh, you're a lawyer, or you sound like a lawyer. Yeah, because you can put words together compressed, concise, and on point to what you want. And usually we're not trained to do that as a general public. So it's the ability to get people to do what you want them to do. And it's not manipulative in law. It's a very assertive thing. And assertive is standing up to a line but not crossing it. And that line is where the other person's rights exist. The other person's do unto others, you wouldn't cross that line. So assertion, or learning to be assertive with words and actions, going up to the line, creates a confident person that is in control. Because some people, if they just learn, I'm going to push real hard, you'll go past the line of assertion, and now you're going to probably break a law or offend someone. So there's a lot in that. It's a balance. It's a nice balancing practice. Back to the Newspeak, if the whole thing in Orwell's 1984 in Newspeak was called linguistic minimalism, and that's what it sounds like. It was to narrow the amount of words. It was to simplify the words like we have today on the mobiles, LOL and SMH and that. And in the end, it becomes this, and even the big corporations use these acronyms. So it keeps the mind imprisoned, because you cannot express freedom. You cannot express freedom if you don't have the words to describe it. And an even more important thing, in psychology, people get unwell psychologically because they don't know how to express their emotions. That's another big thing. They can't figure themselves out because they can't express it. So you get with a therapist, they say, well, look, you need to express these things. How do you really feel about that? Tell me about your past, and how do you feel about that? And before you know it, they can discover their own issues. And we've all have issues, and a lot of them is manifesting where we're being dominated by the shopkeepers that are, or the shop cleaners, and the cleaners are telling us what to do. They've gaslighted us.
Yeah. I will say too, that maybe some homework. Maybe look for words like these as well. Something I noticed the other day, I thought this was very fascinating. It just kind of came to me. The word albeit. I noticed that word used quite frequently amongst journalists, but not really outside of that. So it would almost appear, too, that language can be somewhat exclusive to certain groups of people. Certain groups of people use certain types of languages, right? Philosophers will use a certain type of language quite often. Of course, philosophers love to flex their vocabulary muscles. I think Friedrich Nietzsche would have been a great example of that, or even Jacques Derrida. Any of these philosophers, their vocabulary is very profound. And then you can, of course, see the things that comes out of their minds when their vocabulary is that way as well. But maybe some homework for you guys. See if you can find words like that seem to exist only in certain, groups of people, and maybe learn some of those words and figure out why they exist only in that group of people. Why is it that only that group of people use those words and not others? Just seems, I don't know, it seems a little bit interesting to me. So, anyways, we are going to close this out, guys. We're going to have a short intermission. I'm going to shut this live stream down, and I'm going to start up a new one. We're going to be moving up to the live voice chat. There's a couple people in there right now, so if you guys want to, we're going to have the after show. That'll be in its separate live stream. We're going to just have a short intermission here so that I can get this shut down, get the next live stream started up, and then we'll be back live again in the live voice chat. So,
thank you, and seeing you.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Y'all have a good evening. If you're just watching this video and you're not going to watch the other one, y'all have a good evening.